Welcome everyone, this is the Oregon Realtors Forms updates for the edition 2025-2. We update the Oregon Realtors Forms about twice a year. That's the way we've been trying to shoot for. Usually the first update comes in January or February. The second update comes between August and October or so. This set of updates we originally were shooting for October 1st, but they're going to come out on October 6th. That's when our platforms can get everything done and published and posted. So October 6th is going to be the release date of all the stuff we talk about today. As for what is changing and what we're looking at today, this is the list. The sound is bad. How is my audio, folks? Is it?
Sounds great, Nicholas.
Sounds
Yeah,
good to me. Nick.
Sounds great, Nicholas.
Okay.
I don't think
Julie,
I'm on though.
It might be your speakers or your computer. Apologies if that's the case. I'll try and talk in a way that works with speakers. So for way of explanation of what we're dealing with here, the Forms Update 2025-2, they come from several places. First is user comments. We do have user comments on the Forms website. We ask for comments whenever possible. The comments themselves are one of the driving factors of what changes. We just need to know what people want to see different things on, and that's where we test them out and try the concepts. And we have a giant spreadsheet of all the questions and comments that people have brought forward, and they get vetted by a Forms task force, which is comprised of a fair number of principal brokers from around the state who have strongly held opinions on what a form should look like. And we test stuff through with the principal brokers on that task force. We also have Forms forums that we do twice a year at our conventions. At that Forms forum, we ask people what's going well, what's going poorly, what they want to see change, what they want to see in the forms, and that informs many of the form changes. Similarly, we also have form task force input where they just have meetings every once in a while where they look into the stuff and they ask questions of us of what's working and make changes, ask us to make changes based on what they see as needing updates or modifications. We do principal broker forums. If we hear in a principal broker forum that something is going wrong, we will try and make that modification or that change. Generally, it's important to know what the practitioners are saying works for them and what doesn't work. If it's a principal broker can tell us, my workflow has been improved, would be improved if you do the following things, we can make those changes to help with the workflow process. And lastly, we do attorney review. The attorneys are always looking over the forms and making changes where necessary. As the law changes, as things are updated and modified, we'll add pieces to the contracts based on the law itself. As for what we changed, the list on the right-hand side of the screen is all the changed stuff. We have the major updates, which is the well addendum, the septic sewage addendum, and a new form, which is a seller side agreement. We'll cover those more in depth than other stuff. And then forms with minor changes, which are the sales agreements have some provisions added in to basically just comply with law, contingent right to purchase, the notice of intent, the occupancy agreements, backup offer, historic property, commercial, tenant vacancy, agricultural tenant addendum, the seller carry documents, and the advisories. And it may sound like a lot of changes, but the vast majority of them are one single change done many, many times across all of the forms, which is where we previously would use the word promptly, which is a defined term within the sales agreement that says do it as fast as you can, but at no time should you dilly-dally for more than 2 days, so a maximum of 2 days, but do it quick. We've replaced it where appropriate with just within 2 business days. Rather than having people go back to a defined term, we just say instead, within 2 business days, do the following thing. And so many of these forms that we say have minor updates in them, all that changed is where it previously said something like the seller needs to promptly provide this. It says the seller needs to provide it within 2 business days. So the vast majority of the changes to most of the forms is that minor modification of language. It doesn't even change the implication or the actual application of that provision. It changes only the terminology used to make it more clear for the consumer. But to go through the forms, we'll do them one at a time. We're going to start with the well addendum. This is Form 2.8. Now, this one has undergone several changes, and some of them are relatively substantial, so let's just wander through the form itself, and we'll just talk about what the form does. The first portion of the form is Section 3. I've got it very usefully covered by a text box, so you can't really read what it says, but translated it says, if you're selling property with a well, you gotta do some tests. That's drawn from ORS 448271. It just says do some well tests if you're selling a property with a well on it, if it uses that well for domestic purposes, and it defines what tests you're supposed to do. You can then go into Section 4, which is seller representations and duties to provide records, and where it previously had said promptly, it now says within 2 business days after mutual acceptance, the seller will provide the buyer with their well logs, their well tests, their other records, all the stuff the seller has about the well. They need to provide it within 2 business days. Previously, they had to provide it promptly, which meant within 2 business days. Now it just says within 2 business days. You will hear this exact same spiel many, many times. We're going to cover it a lot in this training. Other places where this section 4 is applicable, it asks the seller to provide records on water quality, shared well agreements if they have one, flow usage tests if they have one from a community well operator. They also represent that to the best of their knowledge, the well in the system serving the property is adequate for its purposes for year-round household and landscaping uses. And if there's anything that's inconsistent with this, let's say the well does not provide enough water for year-round household uses, or let's say there's something haywire with the well and you know about it. You're like, hey, the well smells like eggs. You can disclose that information in the blank lines from line 21 and down. You basically say anything that deviates away from my representation that this well is A-OK and it's great, I will let you know in this section here. The next portion of the well addendum is section 5, which says what type of well was it. Previously, this was written out as one well with the number 1, and then it said 2 to 3 properties, and I believe it was spelled out TWO or THREE. Now it just has numbers. We just made it consistent with using numbers on each one. You specify what type of well you're dealing with in this situation. There are, in how we've set up the addendum, 3 types of wells. There is a domestic well, which is just a well that serves your property, domestic purposes, drinking water and animals and pets and stuff, not commercial farming purposes. That's a domestic well. Serves one property, only on one property, or rather only serves that one property. The shared domestic well is a concept that is created by this form. It's not present in statute, so just be aware. A shared domestic well technically doesn't exist. There is a domestic well, and well is a defined term, and then there's a community well, and a community well is a defined term, and there's some space in between those two that doesn't really have a great definition, and so we created the term shared domestic well when we started this addendum in the 2022 or whenever we release these, 2023 I think is when we release the forms. That shared domestic well concept is essentially a well that feeds domestic purposes, but probably also has a shared well agreement where you're sharing maintenance obligations and you got to split some sort of fees if the well breaks and you got to fix it. So it's a domestic well plus some other stuff that you might have to deal with. Technically at law, still a domestic well, same law applies, same testing requirements apply, but for the buyer's purposes, if you have a shared well, there are other things you got to worry about. It's not just a domestic well that needs to be tested, it's a domestic well that needs to be tested, and if your neighbor takes a really long hot shower, you're not going to have any water. So there's more to think about, and that's why we have a space for you to disclose this is a shared well instead of just a regular domestic well. Community well is a weirdly defined term that's not present in the OHA rules. OHA doesn't actually have a term for community well. It's in the Oregon Water Resources Department's rules, so it's a whole messy thing of the administrative rules. But a community well is arguably defined as an Oregon very small water system, which means some sort of a well or a water system that serves between 4 and 15 hookups, many people that are living on it. For I believe it's between 4 and 10 hookups, and between a certain number of people that are using that water. That's considered a very small water system, and there are different requirements that are applied on those community wells. Generally, there's going to be someone that does the kind of a community well operator that actually manages the well itself, but it gets messy, and there's no great definition at statute or rule that we have to mess with that, so community well has some other additional provisions that apply to it. In section 6, you can define the location where the well is found. Is it on the property or is it somewhere else? Sometimes you'll have a well that was dug on a neighbor's land, or rather dug on your land or the previous owner's land, and then they split the parcel in half or something like that, and the well is just way off your property and it's not there. Define it, let the other party know. There used to be a section 7 that defined the filtration system. What is the filtration system? Where is it? Describe it. The thing that we'd found and what a task force mentioned is for the buyer who's making this well addendum in their offer, they generally just don't know what the filtration system was. There might be one, there might not be one. So they left the system, the buyer would oftentimes leave that provision blank, and it was seen as sort of an unforced issue that would cause some sort of a requirement of a seller counteroffer. So we just cut that filtration provision off. If you are a buyer who's concerned about whether the well water is filtered, ask about it. But there's no actual provision that requires it within the well addendum now, because it was seen as some sort of an issue that the buyer never necessarily got. Now, where the actual changes to the form, where I say there are major changes, this stuff highlighted in yellow are the major changes. In the statutorily required water quality testing provision, which is on domestic wells and shared domestic wells, the well at Oregon law, a seller needs to pay for ordering a coliform, arsenic, and nitrate test on the well from an accredited laboratory. The accredited laboratories can be located on OHA's website. You got to order that test. It used to say promptly. Now it says within 2 business days. So the seller has a short window of time after you're under contract to call up an accredited well tester and say, hey, I got to have you test the well. Once you've got some sort of an accredited well tester coming out to test the well, that's great. The untreated sample has to be collected by somebody who knows what they're doing. There is a literal description in statute and rule that says what it means to have appropriate water handling techniques, and it generally just means have a sanitarian, have a water system operator, have a well driller, a pump installer, have a lab tech, someone who is a professional dealing with this water, have them collect the water. We don't want to have a situation where somebody collects water out of their tap just in a cup or something and then sends it into the lab because it might be contaminated. It could show that, for example, like there's cat hair in the water, and that must show that you've got a cat that fell in the well or something. Like, well, no, I just didn't wash my cups very well and I have a cat in my house. That's why we want someone with trained techniques on handling the well water to do this testing, because they'll make sure that it's uncontaminated and it's just pure water straight from the well is what they're using. This section you see here at the very tail end from lines 30 to 33, this is the new provisions that apply here. Within 2 business days, you used to say promptly after receipt, within 2 business days after you get that test, after that you get those reports, the seller or their designee, the agent, has to send those reports to OHA. That's always been in contract. And they also have to send it to the buyer. That was also in the contract. The part that wasn't before is lines 32 through 33, this piece here that says, such reporting shall occur no later than 15 business days, or write in the number of days you want, blank business days, after mutual acceptance. If the parties intend for water quality tests on a community well, you need to specify those things in Section 8 because community wells do all kinds of weird extra stuff. But your reporting requirement, if you are a seller who is testing a well, has a timeline on it, a drop dead date, by which point you need to get the test done. For the buyer's purposes, they should know when they have this well addendum going on, when they should have those reports, when their right to look at the well stuff is done, or when it should be happening. And what this means is where previously the seller could order a report and just go like, well, testers aren't going to be out for another 25 days, so what are we going to do? Now the seller has an obligation that says, I got to get this test done by the following day. I need to get this well water test or the report completed and sent to OHA and sent to the buyer within this time frame. If it looks like this well test is not going to happen within the time frame, ask to extend the timeline. Hey, buyer, the well inspector is not able to get out for another 5 days. Can we kick this line, this timeline on statutorily required tests another 5 days down the road? We're going to need 20 business days to get this test done. Don't worry, I've already ordered the test. The well tester, here's a forwarded email from them. They're telling me it's going to be another 5 days. You can then explain and extend. That's great. But you do have a timeline that you must accomplish this test during. Under this window of time, you have to get the tests to the buyer. Now, please note, if the seller does not get the tests to the buyer, the provision does not say, seller, you can terminate because buyer, you can terminate because the seller didn't get the tests to you in time. Instead, it says nothing. And in the Oregon Realtor contracts, when the contract has a provision that has some performance obligation, but it doesn't say you can move straight to termination, it means send a notice of default. So if you're a buyer, you set your timeline, 15 business days. Seller, 15 business days have passed. Where's the well test? Oh, I didn't get around to it yet. Now, as a buyer, I send a notice of default. Seller, you said you were going to do the tests on the well within 15 business days and get them to me. I don't have them yet. You have 3 days. Get me the well tests. Otherwise, I have a right to terminate the contract. I, the buyer, can back out because you have not done what you promised to do in the contract. And so you grant yourself a right of termination through sending the notice of default, but it does give the seller a chance to fix it. So if that well test comes in within the cure period, within 3-ish days, the seller is A-okay. The obligation has been performed. You don't have any problems, and the contract is moving along glowingly. So you got your timeline. Meet it if you can. If you're a seller, buyer, if the seller doesn't meet their timeline, you don't get the report when you were supposed to, send a notice of default. Seller, do the thing you promised to do. Line 32, mutual acceptance of the receipt of reports or negotiations. Line 32, when it says 15 business days after mutual acceptance, That is the reporting needs to occur. So the receipt of reports, negotiations of repairs as well. The negotiation on repairs. I'm sorry, I read the question incorrectly. Negotiation on repairs is a completely separate process. It's in the next section. Let's just jump to it, or it's a couple sections from here. There's a portion in here that says buyer. Once you get the reports, you can ask for repairs and negotiate repairs if you don't like the well water reports. So that mutual acceptance timeline is not counting repairs and negotiations, anything like that. It is 15 days to get those reports over to the buyer. So within 2 business days after you get the reports from your well tester, you, as the seller, have to send that over to OHA or to the buyer. And when you send that report over to the buyer or whoever, that has to be within 15 business days of mutual acceptance. So let's say you're a seller and you get the report on a Friday. You need to send that thing on Monday, on Tuesday the next week at the latest. That could be that Monday or Tuesday are with let's say your report happened on day 1. That's technically only day 3 of the process, but it basically means there are 2 moving timelines. Seller has a timeline that starts from the moment they receive the report, and they have a timeline by which they need to send the report over to the buyer. And those 2 things might meet up at some stage. There are additional other tests you can order. Sometimes people are going to ask for different kinds of tests that are otherwise not necessarily required by law, such as a quality test at the faucet or a flow test. Your lender might want a flow test, but the law doesn't require one. Some lenders require a certain number of hours. Some people that are well testers just offer whatever amount of time. We've heard about well testers that do a 15 to 20 minute flow test. That's probably not sufficient for your lender, so just be aware. This section 41 through 43 is the next part. Now, please note, optional water tests are ordered by the buyer. The mandatory ones, seller orders those, so that the seller ends up having a copy of the reports and all the stuff that they need to know about those tests. The buyer side gets to order all the extra stuff, all the flow tests, all the whatnots. Seller cooperates with them to the most extent possible, and the tests under this section also have to be completed within 15 business days or whatever timeline you put in. If the buyer doesn't complete their optional extra tests, the buyer doesn't get to terminate the contract as a result of them. So I, as a buyer, can do a flow test. I say, seller, I want to do a flow test. I'll do it within 15 days. I don't get around to ordering it. The flow test doesn't occur. I can't say, seller, I'm upset about your house because the flow test never came back. I was in charge of ordering it. I don't get to complain about my own failure to order the test or my own inspector being late in pulling out the inspection reports. As a buyer, the tests need to happen within this window on section 8 for you to get the benefit of being able to terminate if they come back poorly. If you do a flow test and it shows that this well is just dripping water a little bit every couple minutes, that's bad. You want to be able to terminate because the well isn't working very well. You want to make sure that you get that flow test done post haste as quickly as possible, because you want to be able to use your termination right or your possible right of negotiation to get yourself the best position in this transaction if you are a buyer. If you don't get that test done in time, you can't terminate based on that test. This is where the termination stuff comes from. It's section 9. If the well records or tests that identify something that is unacceptable to the buyer must notify the seller within a couple business days after receiving those tests. Hey, seller, I got a report that showed that your well is broken. That's problematic. Now, I've told you within 2 days after I got the report. So, seller, this next thing starts. I have 3 days, a well period, to either get rid of this contract, terminate it. Hey, seller, your well is broken. I don't want a house with a broken well. I'm out. Or to negotiate some sort of a written solution. Hey, seller, can you fix the well in 3 days? If so, let's sign an agreement that says you're going to fix it. Otherwise, I'm out. I have 3 days to potentially terminate because I don't like the condition of the well, how it came back. If there is some sort of a written agreement about how the buyer is going to have the seller fix the well, the buyer doesn't have a right to terminate anymore. Seller, you agreed to fix the well? Great. Now we're stuck under a contract where you need to fix the well, seller. The buyer can't say fix the well and then later on go, I changed my mind, terminate. Once you've signed an agreement on how they're supposed to fix the well, they're stuck in it. Buyer's failure to terminate in accordance with the section. If you let that timeline run, if you let the window close, you can't terminate anymore. So a buyer who is worried about the well should act upon that worry and say, I don't want this house anymore because I want a house with a well that works. And that's up to the buyer to make that decision, but they need to make it relatively quickly. If the seller does ask, the buyer is supposed to send the reports to the seller. Even though the buyer may have paid for some of those reports, send them to the seller. The contract says you're supposed to. We can talk about the reason why that is if people are curious, but just know that's what the contract says. The next portion of the well addendum, these haven't changed, but it's just important to point them out again just so we know. Buyer acknowledgement. Hey, buyer, you do understand that when the seller tells you something about the well, that does not guarantee how it's going to turn out in the end. It could very well be that the seller tells you their well is just great and it's working fine, and then there's an earthquake and the aquifer breaks and all the water drains away and there's no more water for the well. All kinds of stuff can happen. It's a wild world. It could be something, we've had situations where somebody gets the well inspected and then like a raccoon falls in the well, like an open well area in the time after they get the inspection, and it dies in there, or a mole burrows the way into the well and dies in there, and there's all kinds of nastiness in the water. That sort of thing happens. And what the buyer needs to understand is when you get a well test, you're only learning how the well is right now, the moment the test occurred. It doesn't guarantee anything into the future. So if something does change, it is tragic when that happens. It is really unfortunate, but it's also, I believe that is natural selection at play. When a mole digs its way into an aquifer, that is the mole's fault. Nonetheless, buyer, be aware. A caveat emptor, you're going to test the well. The closer you test to closing, the more accurate you can guarantee that condition, and the report is going to show of the test of the well that you get when you close on this property, but anything can happen. In the section 11, statutorily required well registration, be aware if there is a well that is unregistered with the Water Resource Department. They have a whole thing where the wells are registered and they have a certain amount of, a number, it's a little tag that they usually put on. If you don't have a well that is registered, Oregon law says within 30 days after closing, it's now the buyer's obligation or the buyer's agent obligation to send in the application to get a well ID on that well. So if you have an unregistered well for whatever reason, there is an obligation at law that the buyer get that thing registered within 30 days after the the closing occurs. Now, why is it not the seller who's selling the unregistered well? Oregon Water Resources apparently just doesn't want to pursue sellers who are already non-conforming with the law, and would instead prefer to just chase after buyers who might be conforming with the law. If you have a seller who hasn't registered a well, don't go back to the mine and try and dig in the same hole, because it's probably not going to show anything. Whereas this buyer is a brand new person to interface with, and Oregon Water Resources might have a good relationship with them, and they can get that thing registered. So the law has just given up on having sellers register their wells and instead puts that obligation on the buyer. So if you are buying a property with a well and it's not registered, be aware, obligation is on the buyer or the buyer's agent to put in the application. It is not complicated. It basically just says, what's the address, where's the well, and I believe they'll send a guy out to make sure, and then they'll just register the thing. So it's not a whole lot. That is the well addendum. The primary change to it is that new timeline that says get your tests done within X number of days. That's the major change. It is relatively substantial for what it does to a party's obligations, so that's why we cover the whole well addendum again. Septic system has largely the same changes. So we're going to cover the same thing in whole again, just so we go over the whole document, but there are roughly the same changes made to the septic system addendum, the on-site sewage addendum. It begins with definitions and background and says septic systems are a thing. Sometimes they're gross. They have all kinds of stuff about them. Septic tanks, solid liquid effluent. They have absorption fields, leach fields, seepage beds. Some of them work with super cool things like sand filters and alternate treatment technology and all kinds of stuff, but it just depends on your septic system. All of them are very interesting. There's a website you can go to look up more stuff about them. And then there are seller representations. Hey, seller, give the buyer all the records you have about your septic system's maintenance process. What have you done to maintain it? Used to say do it promptly. Now it says do it within 2 business days. Similarly, it says basically we assume everything about this septic system is working in perfect order, and if it's not, you'll let us know. So if the seller does have one of those things, they go like, yeah, every single winter it backs up a whole bunch because the water level rises. That's something you're supposed to tell them about rather than just let it go. You need to inform the other party when there are some things that would otherwise indicate that they are not in proper working order or otherwise not compliant with state law. It is worth noting, and this is where I get to get on my high horse, that there is now a rule change within Oregon law that is probably going to apply through the cities, which now says if you have a house that is within 200 feet of a sewer hookup, rather than a property, any portion of a property that is within 200 feet of a sewer hookup, you have to get a permit for repair or a renovation or putting in a septic system. So if you are able to reach a sewer hookup, you have to get the there's a permit required to get the septic system anyways, but if you're within 200 feet of a sewer hookup, DEQ has to deny the request to install or repair a septic system. So if you have a flag lot property and the flag is within like the end of the flag is within 200 feet of a sewer hookup, and you want to repair your septic system, you have to install sewer lines if the city determines that that is required. It has no other standard other than just the city decides, so be aware. If the party does have property that has a septic system and it looks like it's failing or it broke in some way, the ability to get that repaired becomes much more complicated, and you may need to talk to the city to know where the sewer hookups are, because that can radically affect whether or not you can even install or repair the system itself. So just be aware. That's a separate thing entirely. That was a DEQ rulemaking that went into effect in about 2 weeks ago. It was voted on by DEQ, so it's its own thing. But for our purposes in this addendum, tell the other party if anything's going wrong with your septic system. On the actual septic system itself, Section 5 has the on-site sewage evaluation within 2 business days. This previously said promptly, but now it says within 2 business days after mutual acceptance. The buyer will order from one or more contractors who are licensed to provide this service various things. There are checkboxes: buyer or seller's expense, buyer or seller's expense, a tank locate, a septic line scope, an existing system evaluation, whatever it is. There has been added language, which is this little chunk in red that is highlighted here. A service may only be ordered if a box below is checked, indicating which party pays for the service. If you have not checked a box telling us who's paying for the service, you don't order that thing. So if the parties are like, we want to do an existing system evaluation, and you forget to check the box, you're not doing an existing system evaluation. Make sure you've defined that term. It becomes a point of contention if the parties have not checked the box, but they go, well, of course we're doing an existing system evaluation, because both parties can argue, I'm not paying for it. And that, just to avoid that conflict in general, if you're going to ask for a service, make sure you specify using these lines which one is paying for which. So if you check the box at buyer's expense, there is going to be a tank locate and a digging if needed. That is a test you can order. At seller's expense, we're doing an existing system evaluation. That test can be ordered. If you haven't checked the boxes, the test should not be ordered. There is additional language now on lines 28 through 30 that provides just blank space, just write it in stuff. The reason for that is that these existing system evaluations are the DEQ gold standard for septic system testing, but some areas and some testing providers are doing less than the existing system evaluation checklist that DEQ provides. They basically say, like, there are some of these things I don't need to do. You don't need to have me check these certain things. So as a result, I'm going to do a partial existing system evaluation, and this blank space is there to essentially say, this is for me to set up, the partial system evaluation. Dawn in chat says this should have who orders, not just the buyer. If the seller is paying them, they may have a preferred provider who has been servicing the system. We had that discussion in the task force when we were first writing this one down, and it was something that was considered. The reason why it's set out in this case as a buyer orders it is because of the stuff that follows this section here. It essentially is the tests need to be completed within a certain period of time, and if you don't get them completed, you don't have a termination right anymore. It lights a fire under the buyer, whereas if you're a seller and we say seller, within 2 business days, you've got to order from a contractor various tests at your own expense. The seller is not necessarily, as far as intent of the parties go, the buyer wants the fastest, best inspection they can get done. The seller wants potentially the slowest or the least diligent test to be done, because their incentive is different. The seller doesn't want anything to be wrong, and when they do a test, they have to hold their breath because maybe something went wrong. And that disconnect of incentives is a reason why we essentially say buyer orders it, because the buyer is the one in the best position to say, I want this thing done, I want it done now, I want to pick my guy who does this test, because it's my property, potentially my property, that would be protected in the end, and I want to make sure that it's satisfactory to my standards rather than the seller's standards. There are regularly situations where the seller is like, my cousin's a contractor and I trust him implicitly. Has he done septic before? No, but he's a smart guy. And they want to use their cousin to do it, and that's not going to be up to the buyer's standard. And because this is a buyer protection to have that test done, the buyer is the one that should really be in the best position to ask for what they're getting in this. Now, this is similar to that optional well testing section where it says, get your tests done within this time frame. If you don't, buyer, because you're the one that ordered it, you can't terminate based on any result of these tests. If you get the test done, you do your system evaluation, but you get it in on the 16th day, it doesn't get done until sometime later on, you can't terminate because of that system evaluation. You have been delayed in getting your evaluation. There's no termination right that you get that springs from it because you have been delayed on that timeline. So if you're a buyer, figure out your timelines and when you write your offer, or otherwise extend it out if you need to extend it. But the timeline is set so that the seller essentially knows the point in time where they're no longer holding their breath on the chance that the buyer goes, I don't like the septic system, so I'm not going to buy your house anymore. Instead, within a certain period of time, it will be known to the seller that the buyer's septic system testing rights are over. They have ended. Similarly on this one as well, this is something I didn't mention in the optional well testing thing for the buyer in the well test section. If there is a failure to perform that is otherwise the seller is the reason for it. So the seller locks the front gate and stops the buyer's inspector from ever being allowed to get onto the property, or the seller refuses to pay for the service they were supposed to pay for. That doesn't end the buyer's termination right. It's only when the buyer's failure is unrelated to the seller. So if the seller is the cause of the buyer not getting the thing done in time, then it's on the buyer retains their termination right. The buyer's duty to negotiate and termination, or to notify negotiation period and termination rights, is the next section. Very similar to the well thing. Once you get your report, send it to the other guy. Once the other guy gets it, you have a short period of time to either end the transaction because you don't like the system, or to negotiate some sort of a onward-looking solution that works for everybody. Hey, seller, the septic system is gross and it needs something fixed. You should fix that. If we agree to the fix, great. If you don't agree to the fix, I'm out because I don't want a gross septic system. In that highlighted section, you'll see it used to say buyer must notify seller of these items promptly. Now it says buyer must notify the seller of these items within 2 business days. And then the last chunk is the similar thing to the well addendum. Hey, be aware, parties. You don't know what's going to happen on a septic system. We could have all kinds of stuff. The seller could drive a big truck over the backyard tomorrow, and it could crack one of the pieces of the drain field. One of the pipes gets snapped, and that's a huge problem, and there's stuff flowing in the wrong places. Anything can happen. Your test will tell you how the thing is today at the moment of testing. It tells you nothing else. We also have a little link on this to the Be Septic Smart brochure. DEQ has Be Septic Smart, which is a super fun, exciting thing that tells you all the ways to be smart about your septic systems, what they are, what they do, and what the processes are. There's sometimes some other things that it'll inform somebody about. If your client is curious about septic systems, some people are, you can send them the Septic Smart brochure from DEQ. The other big thing, and this is the seller's sale agreement, Form 1.1a. So this is a new form, brand new, that accommodates a very unique situation. And we're going to start with some basics of contract law before we talk in what this thing is. So a contract at its core is an agreement between 2 or more parties competent for that purpose upon a sufficient consideration to do or not to do a particular thing which lawfully may be done or omitted. It's from a case called Finaudy versus Beale from the 1920s, 1919. The case essentially says, if you're 2 people that are agreeing to do something that you're allowed to do, that's great, as long as there's consideration. That's all that's required for a contract to be. Now, an offer, by contrast, is the precursor to a contract, and an offer is a promise that is more than a general expression of willingness to create a legal relation to carry out some definite obligation. If I tell you, gosh, it would be funny if I bought your house, I have not made more than a more than a general expression of willingness to create a legal relationship. If I say I want to buy your house for $100,000, I've got some stuff in writing to make it work, I have made more than a general expression of willingness to create a legal relationship. That's considered an offer roughly at law, because assuming it's in writing, because statute frauds and stuff. But what this essentially means is there's not a lot of meat on that bone for what is required to be a contract and what is required to be an offer. Nothing requires that an offer be given from a purchaser or a buyer in a transaction. The offeror, the person making the offer, is just the party who is presenting the terms, the one that is serving the ball. That's all an offeror is. It doesn't have to be the buyer. Now, in the industry, the buyer has oftentimes or always been the person serving the ball. The seller can always respond. They can counteroffer, hit the ball back. Or they can start with their own offer if they wanted to, but no one's been doing that. So there is some consideration to be had because there is a negotiative strategic reason for wanting to be the one that serves the ball, that initiates the offer. But there's nothing that requires that an offer inherently come from a buyer. There may be reasons why a seller wants to make the offer and be the offeror. If they do make the offer, that means the buyer has the power of acceptance. In the same way that when I make a counteroffer, the buyer has the ability to say yes and accept that counteroffer. It means I probably can't do multiple offers. If I have 3 buyers that want to buy my house as a seller and each puts in an offer and I counteroffer each one of those buyers, that's a problem. You need to do a very specific set of writing to make that work. Otherwise, I should only counteroffer one person at a time because I only have one house to sell as a seller. So if I'm a seller making the offer to the buyer, I need to keep that in mind. I only have one house to sell. So I can really only sell to one person at a time, and it cuts down on multiple offer scenarios. It makes that not available to the seller, which is part of the negotiated risk. If you're a seller, you're losing the benefit of the multiple offer buyers cleaving against buyers to raise the price thing. That's not happening. So why would a seller ever want to make an offer? Well, there are some reasons. Sellers counteroffering. The buyer put in an offer, it was not as good as the seller wanted or had incorrect stuff, and the seller wants to correct it. Hey, buyer, I actually have a well. It's not on a public water system. So you need the well addendum on here because I don't want to get sued. So here's the well addendum in addition to your offer. All the terms are otherwise the same. Seller wants to improve the offer or make it accurate. That's a reason why the seller would wish to make an offer to the buyer. If the buyer is unrepresented and they say, hey, seller, agent, listing guy at the open house, I want to buy this house. I don't have an agent. I don't have forms. I don't know what to write. I want you to write it for me. Would you be my scribe and write it down while not being my agent? That is a really complicated place of agency law. I do not believe there is a clean way for an agent to write an offer for a buyer as a scribe without causing a legal quandary for themselves unless the buyer provides every single detail. The buyer provides the form. The buyer provides every term. Only when that's the case have you probably scribed in a legally riskless way. If you are doing any sort of decision making for that buyer as a scribe, as the listing agent, unrepresented buyer comes in and you go, oh yeah, no problem, let me just grab a form out of my library. You've picked a form library. There are some substantial differences in whether you chose Stephen's Ness forms or the thing that that buyer's cousin who's an attorney had written for them on the back of a napkin. There's all kinds of differences in decisions being made in forms. So by choosing a form, you have made a decision. And if you're not representing that buyer, that decision that's being made can have substantial impacts on the liability it exposes you to as a listing agent. So it may be that if you're a listing agent, you go, hey, seller, a buyer wants to buy your house. They're unrepresented. They don't have an offer. They don't know what to write. They want me to write the offer. How about I write an offer from you to them? What terms would you want to see? Seller, what are you asking for? If you were king of the world and you could ask for anything you wanted and get this buyer to accept, what would you ask for? We can put that in the offer. If you want the buyer to accept, it needs to be reasonable, but like you are the one serving the ball. You have total control over what you want it to say. Similarly, if a buyer is interested in purchasing, but they're uncertain what to do and they are paralyzed by indecision. This happens a lot, where a buyer goes, gosh, I want to make an offer on this house, but I don't want to just be the one that's like, hey, I want to put in your offer and somebody else beat me. And they go, oh, I don't even want to have to deal with the stress of being told no. When a seller says, hey, buyer, do you want to buy my house for $450,000? Here are the terms. And you can just say yes or no. It is much easier for the buyer to say yes to that dress. And that means that for the buyer, it is a substantially streamlined process to accept the offer. Sometimes for a seller, that can be helpful. It can speed things up. It can improve things. And it gets your seller the terms they asked for. Does the seller get the benefit of multiple offers and maybe a higher price? No. But the seller got what they asked for. And the grass is as green as the seller asked for it to be. Last one would be a scenario where maybe a seller wants to make an offer. A situation where the seller has a minimum or a maximum set of terms. They're like, look, I don't want to have to deal with anyone that offers below $400,000. So I'm going to send out an offer. I'm going to say it's $500,000 and let the buyers move down from there. But I'm anchoring it high because that's what I want to see. You can anchor the number at a certain point if you're the seller and see what happens at that stage. Tammy asks in the chat, so a seller can't counter more than one offer at a time, even if they have given notice to all the buyers. There's a question that's sort of at play with that of whether you can do that or not. If you counteroffer and the counteroffer has some kind of ill-advised statement to the effect of, I'm countering your offer, but I don't actually mean this counteroffer. I'm not accepting, you can't accept this offer until I have made my decision with all the other buyers who I've counteroffered to. then yeah, you can do that, but that means it's not actually a counteroffer being made. And instead, you're just essentially asking buyers to approve terms and treat that as their offer to you, which you can accept later on. It's contractually messy. If you are a seller who just says, hey, buyer, you want to put in an offer? Counteroffer, $500,000. Hey, other buyer, you put in an offer? Counteroffer, $500,000. And you do that for all the various buyers, you can still do that at law. That's fine technically, but if multiple buyers accept the offer before you can pull all the other ones back, you're selling your house to two people at the same time. And you only have one house to sell. And that's a huge problem, like an enormous problem for the seller. That's ultimately the risk of sending out multiple counteroffers, is what happens if every buyer hits yes at the exact same time. And you can't send out this rapid, like, everybody, we withdraw, somebody accepted. If you can't send that message in time, you're in big trouble. So we don't, from a risk management perspective, we don't encourage sending out having multiple live balls at any given time with a counteroffer scenario as the seller, because you can potentially get yourself into a whole heap of trouble, and it's gonna be the agent's fault because the agent should know better. Question in chat, so what happens if an unrepresented buyer wants to change terms? Do you have to write that up? If the unrepresented buyer wants to change terms, they can ask for a counter. They can say, like, I want a counteroffer. I want to see different terms. They can counteroffer. That's fine. Or they can say, hey, I want to see different terms. And you can go, seller, do we want to resubmit the offer to this buyer with the changed terms? And your seller can make the decision. You don't have to do anything for an unrepresented buyer if you are not their agent. There is nothing requiring that. I would generally encourage you to ask your seller, are you okay with these things? And if the seller's answer was going to be, why don't you write that offer for the buyer? They'll probably say, okay, let's just rescind our offer and then put in the new one with the terms the buyer was asking for. Tammy says, I've seen it written, the seller has countered more than one buyer and reserves the right to choose. The seller has countered more than one buyer and reserves the right to choose is I would argue, like, radically prepared phrase to put in a counteroffer. You probably would get in trouble if multiple buyers wanted to push on that in a court of law, because you have no timelines, you have no expectations, the buyers don't have any further information. If you said the seller has countered more than one buyer, all buyers may accept this counteroffer, and then the seller will have on Thursday, October 12th or whatever, the seller agrees that at this point they will be able to choose which of these counteroffers that has been accepted they will ultimately accept, and you put in some really formal language that explains exactly what's happening, yeah, maybe. But what I've found in most situations where people are doing that, like, I've countered multiple people and I'm going to be able to pick, it's usually not robust enough language that you're going to protect yourself comprehensively, and instead you're just getting yourself into a point where parties can most likely make arguments about the accuracy of the contract law itself. Why not have a seller's counteroffer that needs a final seller's signature after the buyer has accepted? Ultimately, the seller's counteroffer having, that's instead of the I've countered multiple people. The solution, the risk managed answer, is just to tell all your buyers, resubmit your offer with your best number. That's usually the way it goes. And if it's the seller saying, like, I want to be able to say, hey, all you buyers, here's the best number, which one of you wants to accept it? You do run the risk of multiple buyers accepting that at any given time. Yeah, I'm not saying that it's now not okay to counter multiple people as a seller, but if done improperly, you get yourself in big trouble. If you do it improperly and you do it cavalierly, you get in even bigger trouble. And I generally don't see the incredible value of sending out a message that says, I countered a bunch of buyers at once, rather than just saying, all you buyers, there are multiple offers. Resubmit your offer with your best thing. Wouldn't that put the seller in a difficult position, because if all offers are the same, it would look like they were discriminating? There are potential other problems that do arise. It's a whole thing. Check with your managing broker is probably the best answer. Your managing principal broker will hopefully have an answer where they say something to the effect of, let's not do that. Let's instead just do, like, hey, buyers, put in your best offer. You're fighting against other people, so, sharpest sword wins, and that's your decision to make what you want to do. That's usually going to be the safest answer. So anyways, we have a new form 1.1a, which is a seller's offer to the buyer. Hey, buyer, this is a seller's offer. Changes some language by just shifting it. So, for example, instead of saying buyer offers to purchase this property from buyer for the purchase price, it says the seller offers to sell to the buyer for this purchase price. Otherwise, it's very similar. The sales agreement is pretty unidirectional. It works for either party. That's the reason why a counteroffer is a successful document, even though it's coming from one party or the other. Marissa asks, can we legally tell the buyer agent what the other offers are without the permission of the seller? You shouldn't. You should not be telling the buyer agent stuff that doesn't have permission from your seller if it's integrally related to the seller's decision to sell their house. In general, you should ask your seller, hey, do we want to tell the other buyer agent if we're okay with this or not? And if your seller says yes, go for it. If your seller says, nah, I'd rather kind of hold that back because I don't know if this buyer is necessarily like the one I want to, I've already decided, or whatever other reason they have, you don't want to go outside the advice or the requirements of your own client. So I would generally encourage you away from doing something without the permission of your seller if you're the listing agent. There's a little section in this Form 1.1a that says this is the seller's signature and the buyer can accept or reject by a certain timeline. The only piece that has really changed between the sales agreement regular and the sales agreement seller offer is in the discretionary contingencies. This is otherwise the buyer's due diligence contingency. It's been updated to have this piece that's a seller's discretionary contingency and the buyer's due diligence. So it has all the other stuff you would normally have in a sales agreement. Buyer, do your due diligence, do inspections, have fun, look at it. You can ask for repairs, you can terminate, you can do all kinds of stuff. But it also says seller, unless I waive this right, within 2 business days after we accept the contract, I have the right to disapprove of your financing or you, the buyer, and can back out of this contract. I, the seller, have a 2-day period where I can say, I thought you were good for it, buyer, but then I saw your financing system and I don't trust your bank at all. I have heard bad things about this Silicon Valley bank and I don't want to use it. You said you were all cash, but now I'm finding out you actually, all of your money is from cryptocurrency and I don't trust crypto to exist next month. So I don't believe this is going to work. So you can drop out of the contract as a seller for a short period of time. Marissa says, if we have permission from the seller, can we legally tell the buyer's agent what offers are if we receive multiple offers at once so they are guided about how to submit their highest and best? You are able to, if your seller allows it, you can share any information that the buyer offer has given to you, I would say outside of personally identifying stuff. Like if for whatever reason the buyer sent you like a loan document with their social security number, don't share that. That's probably not cool at all. But anything like the offer was $500,000, you can tell the other buyers that number. That's fine. Your duty of confidentiality is only owed to your client. It is not owed to someone else's client. If you are a dual agent, whole different analysis. Way different problem at play. Dual agent, it's a bad situation. Doretta says you can disapprove the buyer. Yes, the seller should not disapprove of the buyer because they're black or something like that. But in this situation, the seller is allowed to disapprove of the buyer for other reasons. If the buyer, let's take something else for example. The buyer wants to purchase the house. The seller comes along and says, "Hey, I want to sell my house to you, buyer, and you want to buy it," and then they find out that the seller or the buyer is a stripper, or the buyer is someone that owns pot shops, or the buyer is, I don't know, somehow involved in something that the seller finds politically unsavory. They're the head of a political party or something like that. You, the seller, can make a decision to say, I don't want to sell my house to you anymore, based on those non-discrimination related things. Now, if the seller is disapproving of the buyer because of a protected class, fair housing problem. But so I guess in theory, this provision could say the seller may disapprove of the buyer for reasons unrelated to fair housing, but you, the agent, should already know that as a default. Like that should just, you should always understand seller, you can disapprove of the buyer, but it should not be related to a protected class. You can't disapprove of them because of race, nationality, religion, sex, disability, marital status in Oregon, various other things in Oregon as well. They're beyond what even are at the federal level. So yes, there are potentially fair housing implications, but only in the context of a buyer doing something that is already illegal. And I would generally say don't do illegal stuff. But that's the main change between this and a regular sales agreement, is the regular sales agreement just says, buyer, you have due diligence rights, you can look into stuff. This one says seller, you can also back out within a couple days if the buyer seems like they're not matching what you thought they were. If the buyer seemed really sincere and you made their offer and now you're starting to hear things back from them, you go, I don't think this buyer is real at all. I think this might be something that's not correct. Then we've got something at play. And the seller can back out of their own offer made. Those are the major changes. As for minor changes, sales agreements have this change. For everything but the manufactured home and floating home one, because those manufactured home and floating home one, they don't actually own water rights, that it's just a personal property. There's a requirement at law that you say under 537330 that says within 2 business, a certain number of days after mutual acceptance, sellers got to disclose that they have permits, transfer approvals, certificates, and all that stuff. And at or before closing, seller must deliver all that stuff to the buyer. Required at law, now it's a provision in the contract. There's also a thing on FinCEN. There was a anti-money laundering act that happened in the early 2000s-ish, and it's been slowly working its way to more radical ways of being used. And now there's a financial crimes enforcement network that has their whole thing where they say if you've got a sort of sketchy deal that has all these red flags for being maybe money laundering scenario, you got to report this. You got to provide a report. And that report is supposed to come from escrow. If escrow is not present, there's a reporting cascade. Just Google FinCEN reporting cascade if you have a non-escrow transaction that's doing this stuff. That scenario is messy, and I would hope that you're using escrow in general because it makes things much more complicated if you don't. But that's what it is there's a requirement. It's a pretty straightforward thing. Escrow will handle it, hopefully. If escrow is not involved, it gets more messy. At that point, you got to start doing some legwork. On the contingent right to purchase document, we have a new timeline provision. It previously had what this first box said, which is basically what it says in the sales agreement. Those are your timelines. Mutual acceptance starts all the stuff. So if you want more due diligence time frame and you want it to run for some time, like you want to have 10 days after your contingent right is done, then give yourself a longer period of time on due diligence. Now there's a second checkbox that basically says my due diligence period begins when the notice of intent is delivered. My appraisal period begins either after my due diligence happens or after the notice of intent is delivered. So it's a springing due diligence and a springing appraisal timeline that occurs once the notice of intent is received, once the buyer's house is under contract or the buyer's house is sold or whatever else is going on with that. In the notice of intent, we've taken out some language that was irrelevant in places. So for example, the buyer shall promptly notify seller in writing if the offer on the buyer's property is terminated prior to the closing date on buyer's property. Well, if you've closed on the property, the offer is not going to get terminated. You closed. So that language was redundant. And we added the phrase election deadline and removed pieces where it said escrow has to do something promptly because our contract can't force escrow to do anything because they're not a signatory on the contract. So any place where we previously said escrow, do it promptly, we can't force their hand. So we took that language out to just avoid confusion. On the occupancy agreements, there's a provision on the insurance section that says seller will obtain renter's insurance policy with liability coverage of $1 million. Now it says renter's insurance policy or renter's insurance and an umbrella policy with liability coverage of at least $1 million. So there were previously some brokers that were telling us like, I can't get a renter's policy that has $1 million. Others were saying like, yep, State Farm does it. I've got it. It's fine with me. So to make that easier for folks, it can either be a renter's policy with the liability coverage or an umbrella policy with the liability coverage that gets you up to that number. But it should cover those situations where the seller's doing their like going away home warming thing and somebody falls into the barbecue and gets injured and they want to sue the person that owns the property. That liability coverage should apply. Wasn't that already protected by your inspection period? It wasn't going to start until the notice was delivered if the buyer had accepted other than time. So that is the way that the OREF document works, Brittany, but the Oregon Realtors one worked in the opposite stance. The appraisal, so the Oregon Realtors ones basically just said it should all be locked in writing. It should not be a floating timeline. OREF documents have a floating timeline that basically says once this thing is accomplished, then the timeline begins. Oregon Realtors says it begins exactly as written in the contract. Now both of those options are on the Oregon Realtors one, so you can have the OREF version or the Oregon Realtors version. The backup offer, we modified it was effective dates before, now it's just timeframes, and it basically just has it so that the SPDS starts exactly when you become the primary offer. So you get your 5 days after you become the primary offer, whereas previously there were arguments that your SPDS timeframe didn't begin to revoke the deal if you're the buyer. That didn't begin until after you have, it began immediately upon mutual acceptance of the backup offer, even though you weren't the primary position yet. Now it just says once you're in the primary position, now all your timelines calculate and move forward. So SPDS should be caught. There's a lot. I can afterwards I can talk more on that, but there's just a couple more slides I want to cover on stuff that we've got here. Historic property. Previously, there was this exact language at the top of the contract. We've now put it in the special assessment section. It said the property described in this instrument is subject to a special assessment under ORS 358505. That's required at law if it is subject to a special assessment. We put it at the top of the historic property addendum. It's only relevant if you're subject to a special assessment. So now it just says, are you subject to a special assessment? If yes, then this term is here. So nothing changes. It just kind of put it in its appropriate place. Commercial lease document. That whole promptly thing, now it's within 2 business days. Tenant vacancy addendum, that whole promptly thing, now it says within 2 business days. Agricultural tenant, that whole promptly thing, now it says within 2 business days. These all are the same thing. Previously it was arguably identical. It said do it within 2 business days, but do it fast. Now it just says do it within 2 business days. End result, the exact same timeline. On seller carry stuff, we've added some flexibility to it. Now there are a handful of chunks in this that say, for instance, you have interest rate that is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or blank percent. There is also a provision that's under each one of these interest rate things that say make sure it is at least above the AFR, the applicable federal rate, because if it's below the AFR, that's potentially going to cause tax problems and lending problems, and you don't want to do that. So more options on interest rate and more options on time frame. Now it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. Previously there were fewer options, so just more options on time frame have been added. And the last piece, and then I'll answer questions in chat for the time that's left over, but we're running close to the hour mark and I don't want to hold people over for too long, is the advisories. There's been a piece added on the NFIP. If you were present for Jeremy Rogers' training on the NFIP thing and the whole FEMA disaster with the NFIP, the flood insurance program, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on with this one. The short version of it is there's an insurance company through the federal government that provides flood insurance as a result of a flood insurance act. That Flood Insurance Act requires that flood insurance be granted to various people across the nation who were at risk of floods. FEMA has a whole bunch of stuff about that where they basically say these houses are in flood zones, minimum flood hazard zones, and that's troubling. If you're in a flood hazard zone, you need to get this flood insurance. There was a lawsuit from the National Center for Biological Diversity that basically said FEMA, by giving people permits to build in flood hazard zones as long as they have insurance, you're allowing buildings to go up in flood zones. Those flood zones here, those might have concrete or like hard wall buildings, and if there's like a once in a century flood and a bunch of fish gets thrown out onto this dry land area, they might whack into a concrete wall and die, and that could cause real problems for these endangered species. And so this biological diversity statement basically said all these fish and whales might get carried over by this flood and they whack into hard buildings, and so FEMA, because you allowed somebody to build that and get their insurance, you have caused this harm to these endangered species. It's under a whole bunch of lawsuits. There's like a lot of lawsuits to try and stop this because it's a disastrous kind of interpretation of elements of the Flood Insurance Act. But until those lawsuits move anywhere, and if they're unsuccessful or if they don't move anywhere up the court system, what it means is there's a whole bunch of new stuff you need to know about if you're in a flood zone. There's a way to look to see if you're in a flood zone. There's a way to basically understand what the options are that your city or county might take on in that situation. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's at play here. Flood zone stuff. That's where I'll stop and then go to the questions. James asks, was House Bill 3137, will there be a Teams disclosure form? OREA is going to produce that document. Until OREA creates it, we haven't made one. But presumably once OREA creates it, it's going to be a statutory form that basically just every form library is going to grab one and toss it into their library because it's statutorily provided. At present, though, one doesn't exist. Question then is, so things are now lining up between these and OREF forms. There is some degree of kind of a vanishing point that both forms are moving towards, where certain things are just kind of seen in the industry as more effective or less effective, and those are either added or removed from the forms as time goes on. So I imagine over time all things will begin kind of looking very similar, but there still are some relatively radical differences between the OREF forms and the Oregon Realtors ones, particularly termination, how termination is handled, how default is handled in a contract, and how automatic termination works. OREF forms automatically terminate if certain things go wrong. If you fail to do your title evaluation, or if the certain things happen, OREF forms automatically terminate. Oregon Realtor ones don't. They grant you a window to close or to terminate under if something goes wrong, but they don't just end the contract. And so there's a very real difference between the stickiness of an OREF form transaction and an Oregon Realtors transaction, and that was just a decision on how the libraries were drafted in the first place. There are reasons to do either direction in either one. As for the question of why we have both forms and not just one, there are all kinds of great questions on that and great answers. What it essentially comes down to is OREF is a different company. Oregon Realtors made offers to purchase a controlling share and was rejected. As a result, Oregon Realtors said, well, if we're just going to be like riding side saddle the whole time and have no control over anything that's happening as a 30% owner of a company, we will instead do our own forms because we have executive control over that and can make it responsive to the needs of people that we've been hearing about from all of our members statewide. We're going to try and make changes accordingly based on what we're hearing from everybody that talks to us about forms. And so as a result, because we got the legal hotline and all kinds of other stuff, that informed the drafting of the forms themselves. So as for why there are two companies rather than just one, we tried to buy OREF a couple times. I can't speak for OREF is essentially what it comes down to. Oregon Realtors made multiple offers to purchase, didn't pan out. And so as a result, at a certain point, you're just at a stage where the question is do you keep going forward or do you blink and stop? And Oregon Realtors kept going and released its forms. What about a section on who pays and set up and monthly fees for owner carry? Should be a place specifying that. That would be, so the setup and monthly fees, I don't recall if there's a section on that in the seller carry addendum itself, but that is a good point. That could be something that's definitely in there if there's not. Am I correct in understanding you can't mix forms? You either have to choose Oregon Realtors or OREF. That is correct. There are some forms that are interchangeable, and it's mostly in your transactions. It'll be the seller's property disclosure statement. Technically, the final agency acknowledgement is also interchangeable because it's a statutory document that's provided in the administrative rules. Similarly, your transaction, your agency documents are going to generally be their own thing. So like a disclosed limited agency agreement, it just is what it is. A notice of real estate compensation, it's just provided at law. So it's going to be the same document no matter what. In any place where it's not provided by statute, where the legislature hasn't said, copy and paste these exact words, they're generally different enough that it's not advised that you mix libraries back and forth or in addendums and whatnot. And a great example of that, for instance, is like a contingent right to purchase. In the OREF contingent right to purchase document, it says, if this doesn't pan out, you're going to send or rather, let's say like a professional inspection addendum. If this doesn't pan out, you're going to send OREF 057, the termination agreement. So that means the termination stance is if this professional inspection doesn't work out, termination is what we're going to be doing, the new construction professional inspection. I think the actual professional inspection addendum has the same language as well. But it essentially points you to using the OREF termination agreement. Whereas the sales agreement for the Oregon Realtors form says, if there's a reason to terminate, here's the termination documents you'd use from the Oregon Realtors one. So if I then have a reason to terminate based on some failure of a professional inspection, the question is, do I listen to the addendum or do I listen to the core sales agreement? And there are good reasons why you would use either one of those. One is the hub document rather than a spoke document. The other one is a document you had to intentionally add after the fact. And so by mixing those forms and having a situation where it tells you simultaneously throughout your contract to move two ways at once, you create essentially an unforced error where there's a question of just what should you do? And that unforced error is why we say don't mix forms. Sometimes it can be done. It's not advised. It's not best practice because it can create problems, with the exception of documents that are just strictly provided in a literal verbatim sense to everybody. All right, if there are other questions, that's great. Otherwise, we're well past 4 o'clock and you all are accredited. We'll try and tell Kelly it's what, 2 to 3 weeks? Three.
Excellent. We try to get them out soon, but we have to give it at least 10 business days, 2 weeks, in case we're super busy or staff's out. Sometimes they get sick or have a vacation. So yeah, we'll send an email when they're available on our website. You can always check there by logging into our website with your member number, or as we call it, your NERDS number.
You don't call it a NERDS number anymore.
No, they
It's
moved
M1
away. It's
number.
Oh, some of us still do.
some of you require it, James.
Thanks, Nick and
Yeah.
Kelly.
You're very welcome. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Kelly, by the way, thank you for that card I got in the mail. You know what I'm talking about. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Glad you
All
got it and enjoy it.
Cheers, everyone.